The heavy scent of antiseptics mingled with the crisp, metallic tang that permeated the air of the Mortuary Affairs building at DOA Air Force Base. It wasn't a place where joy lingered, but for Sarah Ellis, it had become routine, a harsh necessity in her position handling the fallen. Every shift brought stories she never uttered, but today felt unusually heavy, though she couldn't explain why. Her partner, Max, padded silently at her side, his retired military frame seeming less concerned with the humdrum of their routine. Sarah had been working at the Mortuary Affairs for 3 years now, ever since she returned from her last tour overseas. The transition from active duty to this solemn role hadn't been easy, but it gave her a sense of purpose. She was still serving, in a way, ensuring that those who made the ultimate sacrifice were treated with dignity and respect. As they walked through the sterile hallways, Sarah's mind wandered to her first days on the job. She remembered feeling overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility, the constant reminder of mortality. But Max had been there from the start, a steady presence that kept her grounded. He wasn't just any dog, he was a veteran himself, a retired military working dog who had saved countless lives during his service. Their bond was forged in the fires of war and loss. Max had saved her life twice during their tours overseas, and though his muzzle had begun to grey, his instincts had not dulled. Sarah often joked that Max was smarter than most people she knew, and some days, she truly believed it. As they entered the arrival room, Sarah noticed a new batch of transfer cases had come in overnight. Her stomach tightened, as it always did when faced with the tangible evidence of lives lost. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the task ahead. It was her job to process these cases, to ensure that each fallen soldier was properly identified and prepared for their final journey home. "All right, Max," she said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Let's get to work, buddy." Max wagged his tail once in acknowledgement, then fell into step beside her as they began their rounds. Sarah moved from case to case, checking tags and paperwork, her movements practiced and efficient. Max usually stayed close, occasionally sniffing at a case but generally remaining calm and focused. But that evening, something changed. As they approached a case in the far corner of the room, Max began acting strangely. It started with a low growl, so quiet that Sarah almost missed it. She paused, looking down at her partner with concern. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max's growl intensified, and he began to fixate on one particular transfer case. His nails scratched against the tiled floor as he pushed closer to the metal container. Sarah's eyes flicked to the label, Reynolds, L. Colonel. A chill ran down her spine. In all their time working together, she had never seen Max react this way to a transfer case. His training had been impeccable, his behavior always professional. This was something different, something that set all of Sarah's instincts on high alert. She knelt beside Max, trying to calm him. Her hands moved through his fur, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Easy, Max," she murmured, but her own heart was racing. Something wasn't right, and she knew better than to ignore Max's signals. Sarah stood slowly, her eyes never leaving the transfer case. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, the name meant nothing to her, but clearly, it meant something to Maximum. She approached the case cautiously, half expecting. Well, she wasn't sure what she was expecting. The case looked like all the others, cold, impersonal metal, bearing a name and rank, the last earthly container for a fallen soldier. But Max's reaction had thrown her completely. She trusted this dog with her life, had done so in far more dangerous situations than a quiet mortuary. If Max sensed something was off, Sarah knew she had to take it seriously. She circled the case slowly, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Nothing seemed amiss, at least not to her human senses. But Max remained fixated, his body tense, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Could there be some sort of contamination? A chemical that Max could detect but humans couldn't? Or was it something else entirely? The possibilities were endless, and none of them were good. She knew she should report this, but to whom? And what exactly would she say? "My dog got upset about a transfer case" hardly seemed like a compelling reason to raise an alarm. But the alternative, ignoring Max's warning, was unthinkable. As she stood there, torn between protocol and instinct, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about following rules or procedures. It was about trust in her partner, in her own judgment, and in the system she had sworn to serve. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself. "Okay, Max," she said softly. "I hear you. We'll figure this out." Max's ears perked up at her words, and he looked at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should. Sarah felt a surge of affection for her loyal companion. Whatever was going on here, they would face it together. As they left the arrival room that evening, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. The routine of her job had been disrupted, and she knew that the coming days would bring challenges she couldn't yet foresee. She drove home that night with Max in the passenger seat, her mind replaying the events of the evening over and over. The quiet streets of the military town passed by in a blur, familiar sights barely registering as she grappled with her thoughts. At home, Sarah went through her usual evening routine on autopilot. She fed Max, heated up a microwave dinner for herself, and settled on the couch with a beer. But her mind was still back in that sterile room, still puzzling over Max's reaction. As she absently flipped through channels on the TV, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text. It was from her friend Kelly, another vet who worked on base. "Hey, you free for a run tomorrow morning? Need to clear my head." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Sure. 0600 at the usual spot? Perfect. See you then." She put her phone down, feeling a small sense of relief. Maybe talking to Kelly would help. She couldn't discuss the specifics of what happened at work, but Kelly understood the weight of the job better than most. That night, Sarah's dreams were troubled. She saw endless rows of transfer cases, heard the echo of Max's growl, felt the oppressive weight of secrets she couldn't understand. She woke several times, each time reassured by Max's solid presence at the foot of her bed. As the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Sarah gave up on sleep. She got up, pulled on her running gear, and clipped Max's leash to his collar. They set out into the cool morning air, the streets still quiet save for the occasional early-rising neighbor or delivery truck. Kelly was waiting at their usual meeting spot, a small park near the edge of the base. Her red hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she greeted Sarah with a tired smile. "Rough night?" Sarah asked as they started their warm-up stretches. Kelly nodded. "Yeah, you could say that." "You?" "Same," Sarah admitted. They fell into an easy rhythm as they began their run, the familiar routine bringing a small measure of comfort. As they jogged along the perimeter of the base, Sarah found herself studying the fence line, the guard posts, the layers of security that separated their world from the civilian one beyond. She had always taken these measures for granted, but now they seemed to hold a new significance. "Sarah." Kelly's voice broke into her thoughts. "You okay? You seem distracted." Sarah hesitated, then decided to share as much as she could. "Just had a weird day at work yesterday. Can't really talk about it, but it's got me thinking." Kelly nodded understanding. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes I wonder if we're cut out for this, you know? Dealing with all the..." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely. "Death." Sarah supplied. "Yeah, I wonder that too sometimes. But then I think about the families, about giving them closure. It helps, a little." They ran in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As they circled back towards their starting point, Kelly spoke up again. "You know, my grandpa used to say that the hardest part of being a soldier isn't facing the enemy. It's facing yourself, your own doubts and fears." Sarah mulled over those words as they finished their run. As they cooled down, stretching out tired muscles, she found herself looking at Maximum. He sat patiently nearby, alert as always, his eyes never leaving her. "Thanks for the run," Sarah said to Kelly as they prepared to part ways. "I needed this more than I realized." Kelly smiled. "Anytime. That's what friends are for, right?" As Sarah walked back home with Max, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever was going on with that transfer case, whatever Max had sensed, she would get to the bottom of it. She owed it to herself, to Max, and to the soldiers they served. The sun was fully up now, the base coming to life around them. Sarah squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever the day might bring. With Max by her side, she felt ready for anything. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Mortuary Affairs building earlier than usual. She hadn't slept well, her mind still churning over the events of the previous evening. Max trotted alongside her, seemingly back to his usual self, but Sarah couldn't shake the memory of his intense reaction to the transfer case. As they entered the building, the familiar antiseptic smell hit her nostrils. It was a scent she had long since gotten used to, but today it seemed to carry an extra weight of secrecy and unease. She nodded to the security guard at the entrance, trying to appear as normal as possible despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Sarah made her way to the locker room, changing into her work uniform with practiced efficiency. As she pinned her name tag to her chest, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror inside her locker door. The face that looked back at her seemed different somehow, more serious, more determined. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew she had to do. Military protocols in mortuary affairs were strict and unyielding. Transfer cases were never opened once sealed unless authorized, especially those containing high-ranking officers. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds had supposedly been killed in action during a classified operation overseas. The official report described fatal wounds sustained in a battlefield ambush. Yet, staring at her reflection, Sarah couldn't shake the odd discomfort Max's behavior had ignited in her. She closed her locker and headed to the main processing area, Max following closely at her heels. The room was already bustling with activity, other staff members going about their solemn duties. Sarah's eyes were immediately drawn to the far corner where Reynolds' transfer case still sat, untouched since the night before. "Morning, Ellis," a gruff voice called out. Sarah turned to see Staff Sergeant Miller approaching, his perpetual frown etched deeply into his weathered face. "You're in early." Sarah nodded, trying to keep her voice casual. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a head start on the day." Miller grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes flicking briefly to Max before returning to Sarah. "Well, since you're here, I need you to process the new arrivals from last night. We've got families waiting." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. In her preoccupation with the Reynolds case, she'd almost forgotten about the other fallen soldiers who deserved her attention and respect. "Of course, Sergeant. I'll get right on it." As Miller walked away, Sarah glanced down at Maximum. The dog was sitting calmly at her side, showing no signs of the agitation he displayed the previous evening. Sarah sighed, wondering if she was making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe Max had just been having an off day. Maybe she was letting her imagination run wild. But as she began to work, methodically processing each transfer case, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. By mid-morning, Sarah had finished with the new arrivals. She found herself gravitating back towards the Reynolds case, drawn by an inexplicable need to understand what had triggered Max's reaction. As she approached, she noticed Max's ears perk up, his body tensing slightly. "Ellis." Miller's voice rang out across the room. "My office, now." Sarah's heart rate spiked. Had Miller noticed her unusual interest in the Reynolds case? She gave Max a reassuring pat and made her way to the staff sergeant's office, trying to keep her face neutral. Miller was seated behind his desk when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Close the door," he said gruffly. Sarah complied, then stood at attention, waiting. Miller studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I couldn't help but notice you seem preoccupied today," he said slowly. "Is there something I should know about?" Sarah hesitated. This was her chance to voice her concerns, to share the odd behavior Max had exhibited. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized how it would sound. A dog acting strangely was hardly grounds for raising suspicions about a decorated officer's death. "No, sir," she said finally. "Just a bit tired, I guess." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "You sure about that, Ellis? Because if there's something affecting your work, I need to know about it." Sarah took a deep breath. "Well, sir, there is something." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "It's about the transfer case for Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds." Miller's expression hardened. "What about it?" "Last night, When Max and I were doing our rounds, he reacted strangely to that case. He's never done anything like that before, sir. I can't help feeling that something might be off. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Miller leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of careful neutrality. Ellis, he said finally, his voice low and measured, are you suggesting that there's something suspicious about Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds' death? Sarah swallowed hard. I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm just reporting what I observed. Max is trained for instincts we can't afford to ignore. His behavior was unusual enough that I felt I should bring it to your attention. Miller's jaw clenched. Reynolds is dead, Ellis. He died serving his country. Let's honor the man and leave it at that. The dismissal in his tone was clear, but Sarah wasn't ready to back down. With all due respect, sir, I've worked with Max for years. His instincts have saved lives before. If he's sensing something enough. Miller cut her off, his voice sharp. I don't want to hear any more about this, Ellis. You're here to do a job, not play detective. Is that understood? Sarah felt her face flush with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. Yes, sir, she said stiffly. Miller nodded curtly. Good. Now get back to work. And Ellis? He fixed her with a hard stare. Don't go spreading these concerns to anyone else. The last thing we need is baseless rumors flying around. Dismissed. Sarah left Miller's office, her mind reeling. She had expected skepticism, but the vehemence of Miller's reaction had caught her off guard. As she made her way back to the processing area, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than met the eye. Max was waiting for her, his tail wagging slightly as she approached. Sarah knelt down beside him, scratching behind his ears. What are we going to do, buddy? She murmured. Something's not right here, but no one wants to listen. As she stood up, Sarah caught sight of Captain Rosenfield entering the room. An idea began to form in her mind. If Miller wouldn't listen, maybe she needed to go over his head. Throughout the rest of the day, Sarah went about her duties mechanically, her mind preoccupied with how to approach Rosenfield. She knew she was potentially risking her career, but the alternative, ignoring her instincts and Max's reaction, felt impossible. As her shift neared its end, Sarah made her decision. She waited until Rosenfield was alone, then approached him, her heart pounding. Captain Rosenfield? Do you have a moment, sir? Rosenfield looked up from the paperwork he was reviewing. What is it, Ellis? Sarah took a deep breath. Sir, I need to speak with you about something sensitive. Regarding the transfer case for Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds. Rosenfield's expression sharpened. Go on, he said, his voice low. Sarah explained everything, Max's reaction, her gut feeling, even her conversation with Miller. As she spoke, she could see Rosenfield's face growing increasingly serious. When she finished, Rosenfield was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. Ellis, you understand what you're suggesting, don't you? This isn't just about questioning protocols. You're implying that there might be irregularities surrounding the death of a high-ranking officer. Sarah nodded, her mouth dry. I understand, sir. But I couldn't in good conscience keep this to myself. Max's instincts have never been wrong before. Rosenfield sighed heavily. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Ellis. But you need to understand, this is dangerous territory. If you're wrong about this. I know, sir, Sarah said quietly. But what if I'm right? Rosenfield studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Ellis. I'll look into it. But this stays between us for now. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As Sarah left the building that evening, Max trotting faithfully by her side, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had done what she believed was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just set something big in motion, something that could have far-reaching consequences. The drive home was a blur, her mind replaying the day's events over and over. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah realized that her life had irrevocably changed. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. She looked down at Max, who was watching her with those intelligent, loyal eyes. Well, buddy, she said softly, I guess we're in this together, Huh? Max wagged his tail once, as if in agreement. Sarah smiled despite herself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she could face them with Max by her side. They had been through worse together, after all. As she unlocked her front door, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. Little did she know, the events she had set in motion were about to change not just her life, but the lives of many others, in ways she could never have imagined. The following morning dawned with a sense of anticipation that Sarah couldn't shake. She had tossed and turned all night, her mind racing with possibilities and potential consequences of her actions. As she got ready for work, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in confiding in Captain Rosenfield. Max seemed to sense her unease, staying closer to her than usual as they went through their morning routine. As Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly, she looked down at her faithful companion. "What do you think, buddy?" she asked softly. "Did we do the right thing?" Max tilted his head, his brown eyes full of unwavering trust. Sarah couldn't help but smile. No matter what happened, she knew she could count on Maximum. The drive to the base felt longer than usual, each familiar landmark seeming to pass in slow motion. Sarah's mind wandered to her colleagues, to Staff Sergeant Miller and his stern warning. Would she walk into a storm of accusations and suspicion? Or would it be business as usual, her concerns brushed under the rug? As she pulled into her parking spot, Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever the day might bring. "All right, Max," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let's do this." The mortuary affairs building was quiet when they entered, the early morning staff not yet arrived. Sarah made her way to her locker, changing into her uniform with mechanical precision. Each movement felt deliberate, as if she were preparing for battle rather than another day at work. She had just finished pinning her name tag when she heard footsteps approaching. Sarah turned to see Captain Rosenfield standing in the doorway, his face grave. "Ellis," he said quietly. "My office. Now." Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, but she managed a calm "Yes, sir." She followed Rosenfield through the empty hallways, Max padding silently beside her. The captain's office was at the end of a long corridor, isolated from the bustle of the main work areas. As they entered, Sarah noticed another figure already present, a man she didn't recognize, dressed in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable bearing of a military officer. He stood as they entered, his sharp eyes taking in Sarah and Max with keen interest. "Ellis," Rosenfield said, closing the door behind them, "this is Colonel Hayes. He's here about the matter we discussed yesterday." Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension wash over her. So Rosenfield had taken her seriously after all. She straightened, offering a crisp salute to Colonel Hayes. "Sir." Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable. "At ease, Sergeant Ellis. I understand you have some concerns about one of our recent arrivals." Sarah glanced at Rosenfield, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, she recounted her story once again, Max's strange behavior, her gut feeling, the dismissal from Staff Sergeant Miller. As she spoke, she could see Hayes and Rosenfield exchanging looks, their faces growing increasingly serious. When she finished, Hayes was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Ellis, what you're suggesting, it's not just a matter of military protocol. If there's any truth to your suspicions, we could be looking at a situation with far-reaching implications for national security." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "I understand, sir. I wouldn't have brought this up if I wasn't absolutely certain that something was wrong." Hayes nodded slowly. "Your record speaks for itself, Ellis. And I've heard about your partner here." He glanced at Max, who sat alert at Sarah's side. "Military working dogs don't react like that without good reason." He turned to Rosenfield. "I think we need to take a closer look at this situation. Captain, I want you to assemble a small team. We're going to open that transfer case." Sarah felt a jolt of shock run through her. Opening a sealed transfer case was a major breach of protocol, something she had never seen done in all her time at mortuary affairs. Rosenfield seemed equally stunned. "Sir, are you sure? The paperwork alone." "I'll take full responsibility," Hayes said firmly. "This stays off the record for now. Ellis, I want you and Max there when we do this." If there's something to find, I have a feeling your partner might be the key to finding it. Sarah nodded, her mind reeling. Yes, sir. When? Tonight. Hayes cut her off. 2,300 hours. We'll do this when the building is as empty as possible. Until then, go about your day as normal. Don't discuss this with anyone. Understood? Yes, sir, Sarah and Rosenfield replied in unison. As they left Hayes' office, Sarah felt as if she were moving through a dream. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, each minute seeming to stretch endlessly. She could feel Rosenfield watching her from across the room, his face a mask of professional detachment. When her shift finally ended, Sarah forced herself to go through her usual routine, driving home, feeding Max, making a show of settling in for the evening. But as the clock ticked closer to 11 p.m., she found herself growing increasingly anxious. This is it, Max, she murmured as they got back in the car. Whatever's going on, we're going to find out tonight. The base was eerily quiet as Sarah drove through the gates, flashing her ID to the night guard. She parked in her usual spot, then made her way to the Mortuary Affairs building, Max a comforting presence at her side. Rosenfield was waiting for her at the entrance, along with two other men Sarah recognized as part of the night shift staff. They nodded to her silently as she approached. Ellis, Rosenfield said quietly, "You ready for this?" Sarah took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be, sir." They made their way through the darkened building, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. As they entered the main processing area, Sarah saw Colonel Hayes already there, standing next to the transfer case that had started it all. "All right," Hayes said as they gathered around. "Let's do this." Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as Rosenfield and the other men carefully began to unseal the transfer case. The process seemed to take forever, each movement deliberate and precise. Finally, with a hiss of escaping air, the lid was lifted. Sarah held her breath, not sure what to expect. Beside her, she felt Max tense, a low whine escaping his throat. What they found defied belief. Inside was Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, but he was alive. His body lay in a state of induced stasis, preserved by an intricate web of advanced technology integrated into his chest and limbs. Vital signs were faint but present. It immediately became apparent that this wasn't an ordinary case of a soldier killed in action. "My God," Rosenfield breathed, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent light. Hayes leaned in closer, his expression a mix of shock and grim determination. "Ellis," he said sharply. "Your dog. What's he doing?" Sarah looked down to see Max sniffing intently at the edge of the transfer case, his tail rigid. "He's alerting, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever he sensed before, it's still here." Hayes nodded slowly. "I've seen something like this before," he said, his voice low. "Not exactly like this, but similar. Gentlemen, what we're looking at here is far beyond our pay grade." He straightened up, his face set. "Rosenfield, get on the secure line. We need a medical team here, now. Top clearance only. Ellis, you and Max stay with the patient. The rest of you, secure the perimeter. No one in or out without my express permission." As the others hurried to comply, Sarah found herself alone with the impossible sight before her. She looked down at Reynolds' face, so still it could have been a wax figure if not for the faint rise and fall of his chest. "What happened to you?" she murmured, more to herself than to the unconscious man. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. A team of doctors and scientists arrived, their faces grim as they examined Reynolds and the technology keeping him alive. Sarah watched as they carefully transferred him to a special medical pod, their movements precise and practiced. As dawn broke, Sarah found herself in yet another debriefing, this time with a room full of high-ranking officers and stern-faced men in suits. She recounted her story once again, acutely aware of the weight of each word. When she finished, one of the men in suits leaned forward. "Sergeant Ellis, you understand that everything you've seen and heard is classified at the highest level?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Good," the man continued. "Because what I'm about to tell you goes far beyond normal military operations. Have you ever heard of Project Lazarus?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. No, sir. The man nodded. That's not surprising. Very few people have. Project Lazarus is a highly classified program aimed at prolonging the lives of critically injured soldiers through advanced biotech systems. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds was part of this program. When he was critically wounded in the field, the Lazarus protocol was activated. The transfer case you saw wasn't just for transport, it was a sophisticated life support system designed to keep him in stasis until he could be properly revived. Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. But sir, why the secrecy? Why not just tell the truth? The man finished for her. Because, Sergeant, the technology we're dealing with here is decades ahead of anything the public knows about. If word got out, the consequences could be severe. Colonel Hayes spoke up. The question now is, what do we do next? Reynolds is alive, but barely. And thanks to Sergeant Ellis and her partner here, we've uncovered what could be a major security breach. The room fell silent as everyone considered the weight of the situation. Finally, one of the officers spoke. We need to move Reynolds to a secure facility. Continue the revival process under controlled conditions. The man in the suit nodded. Agreed. And as for Sergeant Ellis and her dog, Sarah felt her heart rate spike. What would happen to them now? Hayes cleared his throat. If I may, sir. Ellis and Max have proven themselves to be invaluable assets. I'd like to recommend them for special assignment to Project Lazarus. We could use someone with their unique capabilities. Sarah blinked in surprise. This was not at all what she had expected when she first voiced her concerns about that transfer case. The man in the suit studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. Sergeant Ellis, consider yourself and your partner reassigned, effective immediately. Welcome to Project Lazarus. As the meeting broke up, Sarah found herself standing in a daze, trying to process everything that had happened. She looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with unwavering loyalty. Well, buddy, she said softly. Looks like we're in for quite an adventure. Max wagged his tail, and Sarah couldn't help but smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. The world as she knew it had changed overnight, but some things, like the bond between a soldier and her faithful companion, remained constant. As she left the building, stepping out into the bright morning sun, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. Project Lazarus. A new assignment. A world of secrets she was only beginning to understand. One thing was certain, life would never be the same again. The days following the discovery of Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds' true condition passed in a whirlwind of activity for Sarah Ellis. Her entire world had been turned upside down, and she found herself thrust into a realm of secrecy and advanced technology that she had never imagined existed. The morning after the revelation, Sarah reported to a nondescript building on the far side of the base. It looked like any other administrative office from the outside, but as soon as she stepped through the doors, she knew she was entering a different world entirely. Sergeant Ellis, a crisp voice greeted her. A woman in a lab coat approached, her piercing blue eyes studying Sarah intently. I'm Dr. Samantha Reeves, lead scientist for Project Lazarus. Welcome to our world. Sarah shook the offered hand, acutely aware of Max's presence at her side. Thank you, I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing here, to be honest. Dr. Reeves smiled, a hint of warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. That's understandable. Come with me, and we'll start to change that. As they walked through the facility, Sarah's head swiveled from side to side, trying to take in everything she saw. Labs filled with equipment she couldn't begin to understand, screens displaying data in formats she'd never seen before, and everywhere, people working with an intensity that spoke of the project's importance. They entered a conference room where several people were already seated, including Colonel Hayes. Sarah came to attention, but Hayes waved her off. At ease, Ellis. Have a seat. It's time you learned what you've stumbled into. Over the next few hours, Sarah's understanding of reality was fundamentally altered. Project Lazarus, she learned, had been in development for over a decade, born out of a desire to save soldiers who would otherwise be lost to battlefield injuries. The technology you saw with Reynolds, Dr. Reeves explained, is the culmination of years of research and development. It's a combination of advanced life support systems, nanotechnology, and cutting-edge bioengineering. But why keep it secret? Sarah asked, her mind reeling with the implications. Couldn't this technology save countless lives? Colonel Hayes leaned forward, his face grave. Think about it, Ellis. If our enemies knew we could potentially bring soldiers back from the brink of death, how would that change the nature of warfare? And that's not even considering the ethical implications, or the potential for misuse in civilian applications. Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to understand the weight of the secret she now carried. So, what happens now? She asked. With Reynolds, I mean. Dr. Reeves took over. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds was our first, well, I suppose you could call him our first success. When he was critically injured in the field, we activated the Lazarus protocol. The transfer case you discovered was actually a sophisticated stasis pod, designed to keep him stable until we could attempt full revival. And now? Sarah prompted. Now, we're in uncharted territory, Dr. Reeves admitted. We've never brought someone back from such a prolonged stasis before. We're hopeful, but there are no guarantees. The gravity of the situation settled over the room. Sarah found herself thinking of the family Reynolds must have, people who believed he was dead. The ethical implications were staggering. Where do I fit into all this? Sarah asked finally. And Max? Colonel Hayes smiled for the first time since the meeting began. That's where things get interesting, Ellis. Your dog's reaction to Reynolds' case, it's not the first time we've seen something like that. We've had instances before where animals seemed to sense something different about Lazarus subjects. But never with the clarity and certainty that Max displayed. Dr. Reeves picked up the thread. We believe that the nanotechnology we use in the Lazarus process emits some kind of signal that certain animals can detect. If we could understand what Max is sensing, it could be a breakthrough for the project. Sarah looked down at Max, who sat alert at her feet, seemingly aware that he was the topic of conversation. So you want to study him? Not exactly, Colonel Hayes said. We want you both to join the project. Your military experience, combined with your unique connection to Max, makes you ideally suited to help us navigate the challenges we're facing. Sarah's mind raced. This was far beyond anything she had ever imagined for her career. What exactly would we be doing? For starters, Dr. Reeves said, we'd like you to work with our team in monitoring and interpreting Max's reactions to various Lazarus subjects. But more than that, we need someone with your background to help us understand the practical implications of this technology in the field. Colonel Hayes nodded. You've seen combat, Ellis. You understand the realities of warfare in a way that many of our scientists don't. Your input could be invaluable as we refine and potentially deploy this technology. Sarah sat back, trying to process everything she'd heard. It was an incredible opportunity, but also an enormous responsibility. Can I have some time to think about it? She asked. Of course, Colonel Hayes replied. But I'm afraid we'll need your decision by tomorrow. The nature of this project demands absolute secrecy and commitment. As Sarah left the meeting, her head spinning with all she had learned, she found herself in a daze. The familiar sights of the base seemed strange now, as if she was seeing everything through a new lens. She drove home in silence, Max a comforting presence in the passenger seat. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah realized she had no memory of the drive. Her mind was too full of nanotechnology, secret projects, and the ethical quandaries that came with them. Inside her house, Sarah sank onto the couch, Max immediately jumping up to lay his head in her lap. She scratched behind his ears absently, her thoughts a whirlwind. What do you think, buddy? She asked softly. Should we do this? Max looked up at her, his brown eyes full of trust and loyalty. Sarah smiled despite herself. In a world that had suddenly become infinitely more complex, Max's unwavering companionship was a constant she could rely on. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself pacing her small living room, weighing the pros and cons of accepting the offer. The opportunity was incredible, a chance to be at the forefront of technology that could save countless lives. But the secrecy, the ethical implications, it was a heavy burden to bear. She thought of Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, lying in stasis, caught between life and death. She thought of the families of fallen soldiers, and how this technology could change everything for them. And she thought of Max, somehow able to sense what no human could, potentially holding the key to unlocking the full potential of Project Lazarus. As midnight approached, Sarah found herself sitting on her back porch, staring up at the stars. Max lay at her feet, a constant, comforting presence. In that moment of quiet reflection, Sarah felt a sense of clarity wash over her. This was bigger than her. Bigger than her career, her doubts, her fears. This was about serving her country, and potentially humanity, in a way she never could have imagined. And if Max could play a role in that, well, they were a team. They always had been. The next morning, Sarah walked into the Project Lazarus facility with her head held high, Max trotting confidently at her side. She found Colonel Hayes in his office, looking as if he hadn't slept. "Sir," she said, coming to attention. "Sergeant Sarah Ellis, reporting for duty with Project Lazarus." Hayes looked up, a smile breaking across his tired face. "Welcome aboard, Ellis. We've got a lot of work to do." And just like that, Sarah's life changed forever. The days that followed were a blur of briefings, training sessions, and introductions to technology that seemed more science fiction than reality. She worked closely with Dr. Reeves and her team, helping them design protocols for using Max's unique abilities in their research. They started with simple tests, exposing Max to different levels of nanotechnology and recording his reactions. Sarah quickly proved her worth, her deep understanding of Max's behavior providing insights that the scientists might have missed. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself growing more comfortable in this new world. The ethical questions still nagged at her, but she could see the potential for good in what they were doing. And through it all, Max was by her side, as steady and loyal as ever. 1 month into her new assignment, Sarah stood in the observation room, watching as the medical team prepared to bring Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds out of stasis. It was a critical moment, the first time they had attempted to revive someone from such a prolonged period in the Lazarus system. As the machines hummed and the doctors worked, Sarah felt a familiar nudge at her leg. She looked down to see Max, his eyes fixed on the scene before them, his body tense with alertness. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, her hand automatically going to the back of his neck. "What do you sense?" In that moment, as Max's muscles quivered under her touch and the monitors in the next room began to beep with increasing urgency, Sarah felt the weight of her new reality settle fully upon her shoulders. This was her world now, a world of cutting-edge science, life-and-death decisions, and secrets that could change the course of history. But as she watched the medical team work and felt Max's steady presence beside her, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever challenges Project Lazarus might bring, she and Max would face them together. They were more than partners now, they were pioneers on the frontier of a new era in human history. As Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds took his first independent breath in months, Sarah squared her shoulders, ready to step fully into her new role. The future was uncertain, filled with both promise and peril, but she was ready to face it head-on. Project Lazarus had been unveiled to her, and now, it was time to see just how far this rabbit hole would go. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself fully immersed in the world of Project Lazarus. The initial awe and excitement of being part of such groundbreaking work had given way to a more complex mix of emotions. Every day brought new discoveries, but with them came increasingly difficult ethical quandaries. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds' revival had been a success, at least in the most basic sense. He was alive, conscious, and slowly regaining his strength. But the man who had emerged from stasis was not quite the same as the one who had gone in. His memories were fragmented, his personality subtly altered. The team celebrated it as a win, but Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they had crossed a line. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah arrived at the facility to find an unusual buzz of activity. As she made her way to her workspace, Max trotting faithfully at her side, she overheard snippets of excited conversation. "Another one, field test. General Whitmore." Sarah's stomach tightened. She quickened her pace, heading straight for Dr. Reeves' office. The scientist looked up as Sarah entered, her face a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Ah, Ellis. Good, you're here. We've got a situation developing." Sarah took a seat, Max settling at her feet. "What's going on, Doc?" Dr. Reeves leaned forward, her voice low. "We've received word from a Black Ops team in Syria. One of their operatives, a Captain James Harper, was critically wounded during a mission. They've initiated the Lazarus protocol in the field." Sarah felt her breath catch. "In the field? I thought we were still in the testing phase." "We were," Dr. Reeves said grimly. "But General Whitmore pushed for a field trial. Said we couldn't afford to wait any longer." The implications hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. They were using experimental technology on an active serviceman, without the extensive support systems they had here at the facility. The risks were enormous. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. "We're assembling a team to go in and extract Captain Harper. We need you and Max there. If something goes wrong with the Lazarus systems, Max might be our best chance at detecting it." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing through the logistics. "When do we leave?" "Wheels up in 3 hours. Get yourself ready, Ellis. This is going to be a hell of a ride." The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Sarah found herself on a military transport plane, then a helicopter, then trudging through the Syrian desert with a team of special ops soldiers and Lazarus technicians. Max stayed close, his training kicking in as they moved through hostile territory. When they finally reached the safe house where Captain Harper was being held, Sarah's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. As they entered the makeshift medical bay, she felt Max tense beside her. Captain Harper lay on a gurney, hooked up to a portable version of the Lazarus system. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, but there was no other sign of life. Dr. Reeves immediately went to work, her fingers flying over the system's controls. "Vitals are stable, but there's some kind of anomaly in the neural interface," she muttered. Sarah knelt beside Max, her hand on his back. "What do you think, boy? What are you sensing?" Max's ears were pricked forward, his body rigid with alertness. He let out a low whine, then began to paw at the ground near the Lazarus unit. "Dr. Reeves," Sarah called out. "Max is picking up on something. I think it's coming from the base of the unit." The next few hours were tense as the team worked to stabilize Captain Harper and diagnose the issue with the Lazarus system. Sarah stayed close, interpreting Max's reactions and providing insights that proved crucial in navigating the crisis. By the time they had Harper stable enough for transport, Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated. They had done it. They had saved a man who, by all rights, should have been dead. But as they began the journey back to base, the weight of what they had done settled over Sarah. They had pushed the boundaries of science and ethics, playing God in the Syrian desert. And now they were bringing Captain Harper back to a world he might not be ready for, to a life he might not recognize. The debriefing back at Project Lazarus headquarters was intense. General Whitmore himself was present, his weathered face set in stern lines as he listened to the team's report. "Outstanding work, all of you," he said when they had finished. "This proves that Lazarus is ready for full field deployment. We'll begin integrating the technology into our special ops teams immediately." Sarah felt a jolt of alarm. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think we're ready for that." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Sarah swallowed hard but pressed on. "The ethical implications alone, we're talking about fundamentally altering the nature of warfare. Not to mention the potential for misuse if this technology falls into the wrong hands." General Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning the security of this project, Sergeant?" "No, sir," Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm questioning whether we've fully considered the consequences of what we're doing here." Dr. Reeves spoke up, her voice cautious. "Sarah has a point, General. We're still learning about the long-term effects of the Lazarus process. Rolling it out on a large scale at this stage could be premature." The general's face darkened. "We're at war, Doctor. Every day we delay could cost American lives. Lives that Lazarus could save. But at what cost?" Sarah pressed. "Sir, we don't fully understand what we're doing to these soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds is still struggling to adjust. Captain Harper, we don't even know if he'll wake up the same person he was before. That's a risk we have to take, Whitmore snapped. The potential benefits far outweigh the risks. Sarah felt her frustration rising. Sir, with all due respect, you're not the one who has to live with those risks. The soldiers are. Their families are. The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Sarah could feel the weight of what she had done, challenging a superior officer, questioning the very project she had sworn to support. Finally, Colonel Hayes spoke up. General, perhaps we should take Sergeant Ellis's concerns under advisement. She's been on the front lines of this project, and her insights could be valuable as we move forward. Whitmore's jaw clenched, but after a moment, he gave a curt nod. Fine. Ellis, I want a full report on your concerns, on my desk by 0800 tomorrow. But make no mistake, Lazarus is moving forward. Your job is to help us do it right, not to question whether we do it at all. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. As the meeting broke up, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had spoken up, had made her concerns heard. But she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Later that evening, as she sat in her small office putting together her report, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She looked down at Max, who lay at her feet, ever faithful. What have we gotten ourselves into, buddy? She murmured. Max lifted his head, his brown eyes full of unwavering trust. In that moment, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever ethical minefields they had to navigate, she knew she had to stay the course. She was in a unique position to influence the direction of Project Lazarus, to be a voice for the soldiers whose lives would be forever changed by this technology. As she turned back to her computer, Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard with renewed determination. She would make her case, lay out her concerns in clear, undeniable terms. And maybe, just maybe, she could help steer Project Lazarus in a direction that honored the sacrifices of the men and women who served, while still pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The ethical battle lines had been drawn. Now it was up to Sarah to fight for what she believed was right, no matter the cost to her career or her peace of mind. As she worked late into the night, Max a steady presence at her side, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But it was a journey she was prepared to take, for the sake of the soldiers they sought to save, and for the future of warfare itself. The confrontation with General Whitmore had been just the opening salvo in what promised to be a prolonged ethical struggle. And Sarah Ellis was ready to fight. The weeks following Sarah's confrontation with General Whitmore were tense, to say the least. Her report, meticulously detailed and unflinching in its assessment of the ethical pitfalls of Project Lazarus, had stirred up a hornet's nest of debate within the upper echelons of military command. Sarah found herself walking a tightrope, balancing her duties to the project with her growing conviction that they needed to proceed with far more caution. She threw herself into her work, spending long hours in the lab with Dr. Reeves and the rest of the team, pushing to understand every nuance of the Lazarus technology. Max, as always, was by her side, his presence a constant reminder of why she had spoken up in the first place. It was his unique ability, his instinctive understanding of the Lazarus subjects, that had made all of this possible. And it was the bond between human and animal, between soldier and companion, that Sarah felt they were in danger of losing sight of in their rush to push the boundaries of science and warfare. One crisp morning in late fall, Sarah arrived at the facility to find an unusual buzz of activity. As she made her way to her lab, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her heart race. Congressional hearing. Project Lazarus, full disclosure. She quickened her pace, Max trotting at her heels, and burst into Dr. Reeves' office without knocking. The scientist looked up, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You've heard, then?" Dr. Reeves asked, not waiting for Sarah to speak. Sarah nodded, trying to catch her breath. "Is it true? Are they really going to declassify Lazarus?" Dr. Reeves leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her graying hair. "It looks that way. Your report, well, let's just say it made its way up the chain of command." "Way up?" "There's going to be a closed-door congressional hearing next week. They want to review the entire project, from top to bottom." Sarah felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Relief that her concerns were being taken seriously, fear of the potential fallout, and a strange sense of pride that she had played a part in bringing this to light. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, absently reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. Dr. Reeves shook her head. "I don't know. Best case scenario? We get more oversight, more ethical guidelines, maybe even more funding to explore the long-term implications of what we're doing. Worst case? They shut us down entirely." The next week was a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah found herself working around the clock, compiling data, preparing presentations, and steeling herself for the grilling she knew was coming. Through it all, Max was her constant companion, a steady presence that kept her grounded when the stress threatened to overwhelm her. The day of the hearing dawned clear and cold. Sarah stood before her mirror, adjusting her dress uniform, trying to quell the butterflies in her stomach. Max sat at her feet, looking up at her with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand everything. "Well, buddy," she said softly, "this is it. Whatever happens today, we're in it together, right?" Max gave a soft woof of agreement, and Sarah couldn't help but smile. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and headed out to face whatever the day might bring. The hearing was intense, to say the least. Sarah found herself facing a panel of stern-faced congressmen and women, all of whom seemed to have strong opinions about Project Lazarus. She answered their questions as honestly and thoroughly as she could, never shying away from the ethical concerns she had raised in her report. To her surprise, she found an unexpected ally in General Whitmore. The man who had initially dismissed her concerns now stood beside her, acknowledging the validity of her arguments even as he defended the potential benefits of the project. "Sergeant Ellis," one congressman asked, his voice sharp, "you were instrumental in bringing these ethical concerns to light. Yet you continue to work on the project. How do you reconcile that?" Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "Sir, I believe in the potential of Project Lazarus to save lives. But I also believe that we have a responsibility to proceed with caution, to consider the full implications of what we're doing. My goal in raising these concerns was never to shut down the project, but to ensure that we're doing it right." As the hearing stretched into its second day, Sarah found herself growing more confident. She spoke passionately about the need for ethical oversight, about the importance of considering the human element in their rush to push the boundaries of science. And then came the moment that would change everything. "Sergeant Ellis," the committee chairwoman said, "we understand that your military working dog, Max, plays a crucial role in Project Lazarus. Could you elaborate on that?" Sarah glanced down at Max, who sat alertly at her side, then back at the panel. Max's ability to sense and react to the Lazarus technology has been invaluable to our research. But more than that, he represents something I think we've been in danger of forgetting, the human element in all of this." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Max isn't just a tool or a piece of equipment. He's my partner. We've been through hell and back together, and that bond, that trust, is what allows us to do what we do. And I think that's what we need to remember as we move forward with Lazarus, that we're dealing with people, with soldiers who have lives and families and experiences that go beyond their usefulness on the battlefield." The room fell silent as Sarah's words sank in. She could see the impact they had made, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. And in that moment, she knew that whatever happened next, she had made a difference. The fallout from the congressional hearing was swift and far-reaching. Project Lazarus was officially declassified, sparking a media frenzy and public debate that would rage for months. There were calls for further investigation, demands for more transparency, and heated arguments about the ethics of the technology. But for Sarah and the Lazarus team, the most significant changes were happening behind the scenes. With the project now in the public eye, there was a renewed focus on ethical considerations and long-term research. Dr. Reeves found herself with an expanded budget and mandate to explore the full implications of the Lazarus technology, not just its military applications. And Sarah? She found herself in a position she had never expected, as the public face of Project Lazarus's Ethical Oversight Committee. Her candor and integrity during the hearing had impressed the right people, and she now had a platform to ensure that the human element was never forgotten in their pursuit of scientific advancement. As for Max, he became something of an unwitting celebrity. The story of the military working dog who could sense the Lazarus technology captured the public imagination, and Sarah found herself fielding requests for interviews and appearances. But through it all, Max remained blissfully unaware of the stir he had caused. For him, life continued as it always had, loyal to Sarah, ready for the next task, and unyielding in his devotion. One evening, months after the hearing, Sarah found herself sitting on the porch of her small house on base, Max dozing at her feet. She was reading through the latest batch of Lazarus research reports, marveling at how far they had come and how much further they had to go. A soft whine from Max made her look up. The old dog was watching her, his eyes full of that timeless wisdom that had guided them through so much. Sarah smiled, reaching down to ruffle his fur. "You know, buddy," she said softly, "I think we've really started something here. Whatever happens next, we've made a difference. We've helped redefine what it means to serve, to sacrifice, to come home." Max's tail thumped against the porch in agreement, and Sarah felt a wave of contentment wash over her. The future was still uncertain, filled with both promise and peril, but she was ready to face it head-on. As the sun set on another day, Sarah Ellis looked out over the base that had been her home for so long. It looked the same as it always had, but she knew that beneath the surface, everything had changed. Project Lazarus had reshaped the landscape of military science and ethics, and she had played a part in steering it towards a more thoughtful, human-centered approach. But more than that, she had learned a profound lesson about the power of partnership, of the bond between human and animal. Max had been more than just a working dog, he had been a catalyst for change, a reminder of the fundamental truths that should guide their work. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she knew she was ready to face them. With Max by her side and the lessons of Lazarus to guide her, she was prepared to continue pushing the boundaries of what was possible while never losing sight of the human lives at the heart of it all. The legacy of Project Lazarus had been redefined, and with it, the very nature of service and sacrifice. And as Sarah scratched behind Max's ears one last time before heading inside, she knew that their journey was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning.